On the morning of August 19, 1943, a German Foreign Ministry courier named Fritz Kolbe sat in a waiting room in the Swiss capital of Bern and stared at a door. Behind the door was the British intelligence station. Inside were trained professionals whose entire job was to find people exactly like him. Germans with access to secrets willing to talk. He had crossed the border from Germany 12 hours earlier with a diplomatic pouch full of classified documents. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had thought about this moment for 2 years. He knocked. He was shown in. He explained who he was, what he had, and what he wanted to do. The British officer looked at him for a moment and said they were not interested. Then he was shown back out. Kolbe sat back down in the waiting room. He was 42 years old. He had just committed an act that, if discovered, would result in his execution. He had brought with him documents that he had spent weeks collecting, copying by hand after hours, hiding in his apartment behind a false panel he had built himself. He had crossed an international border with those documents concealed inside a diplomatic pouch he was not supposed to open. He had done all of this on the calculation that the British would want what he had. They did not want what he had. He sat in that waiting room for a while. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out into the street. He had one option left, and it was considerably more dangerous than the first. To understand why Fritz Kolbe ended up in that waiting room, you have to go back to a specific afternoon in 1942 when he was sitting at his desk in the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, processing diplomatic correspondence. This was his job. He was not an intelligence officer, not a military man, not an agent of anything. He was a career bureaucrat who had worked for the German Foreign Service since 1925, who spoke 4 languages, who was considered reliable, efficient, and entirely unremarkable by everyone who knew him. That last part was not accidental. Kolbe had refused to join the Nazi Party in 1933 when joining was not yet mandatory and refusal was still merely a career inconvenience rather than a death sentence. He had watched colleagues join and receive promotions. He had watched the foreign ministry fill with party members brought in by Ribbentrop to replace the old professional staff. He had been passed over for senior postings in Paris, Madrid, and Tokyo because his file noted no party membership. He had been sent instead to South Africa, then to Spain, then back to Berlin, each assignment smaller and more peripheral than the last. By 1942, he was working as a senior assistant to Karl Ritter, the foreign ministry liaison to the German military high command. It was a significant post in terms of the documents that crossed his desk. It was an insignificant post in terms of what the Nazi hierarchy thought of the man sitting behind it. Nobody watched Fritz Kolbe carefully because nobody considered Fritz Kolbe worth watching. This was the most important mistake the Third Reich ever made about a single individual. The afternoon that changed everything was in the spring of 1942. Kolbe was processing a batch of diplomatic cables when he came to a document he would describe years later as the moment he understood exactly what he was working for. It was a communication from the German embassy in a neutral country. He would not say which one when interviewed after the war, protecting sources even decades later, that contained a list of names. Jewish families. The document detailed their planned deportation, the destination, the timeline. It had been signed by Ribbentrop's office. It carried the official stamps and seals of the Foreign Ministry of the German Reich. It had passed through Kolbe's hands as routine correspondence. He held it for a long time. Then he filed it because his job was to file it, and he went home. He did not sleep. He lay in his apartment and thought about the file. He thought about all the other files he had processed in the previous 3 years. The cables about occupied territories, the reports from embassies in countries Germany had taken, The documents he had initialed and stamped and moved from one tray to another as part of a bureaucratic process that was, he now understood with complete clarity, the administrative infrastructure of mass murder. He was not a dramatic man. He was not given to gestures. He had spent 17 years in government service learning to be precise, thorough, and invisible. What he felt that night was not the kind of thing that produces a speech or a manifesto. It was quieter and more permanent than that. He made a decision, and the decision was simple. He was going to do something with what he knew. The problem was that he had no idea how. For the next year, Kolbe gathered information the way he did everything else, methodically, carefully, without drawing attention to himself. He began staying late at the office on nights when the building was quiet. He read documents he was not assigned to read, using his access to the filing systems that his seniority gave him. He copied out passages by hand on paper he took home in his jacket pocket. He began to understand the full scope of what moved through the foreign ministry. Military assessments. Diplomatic communications between Berlin and every German embassy in the world. Reports on the disposition of German forces, the locations of weapons programs, the internal deliberations of the Nazi leadership. He was sitting at the center of an intelligence operation. He just had not been running it for anyone yet. In early 1943, an opportunity appeared. Karl Ritter needed a courier to carry a diplomatic pouch to Bern, Switzerland. The regular courier was sick. Kolbe, reliable and invisible and trusted with sensitive materials, was the obvious substitute. He volunteered for the assignment before Ritter finished explaining it. Ritter approved without a second thought. Kolbe spent the following 3 weeks preparing for a journey he had been thinking about for a year. He selected documents from those he had copied and memorized, prioritizing materials that would be impossible to fabricate. Cables with original stamps, diplomatic communications with authentication marks, documents that any trained intelligence officer would immediately recognize as genuine. He worked slowly and carefully, in the same methodical way he did everything. He left no trace. By the time he packed his briefcase for Bern, he had nearly 200 classified documents. He crossed the Swiss border on August 18, 1943. The border guards checked his diplomatic credentials and waved him through. He delivered the official pouch to the German embassy in Bern. Then he walked to the British intelligence station and knocked on the door. And they told him they were not interested. The British refusal was not malicious, and it was not stupid. It was a product of institutional memory. In 1939, British intelligence had been badly burned by the Venlo incident, in which 2 MI6 officers had been lured to the Dutch border by Germans pretending to be anti-Nazi conspirators, kidnapped and taken to Germany. The operation had exposed several British intelligence networks and killed careers and men. Since Venlo, MI6 had maintained a standing policy of extreme caution toward any German who walked in off the street claiming to have secrets. The policy had a logic. It also meant they turned away Fritz Kolbe. He did not go back to the German embassy. He did not go to the train station. He sat in a cafe near the old city center of Bern and thought about what to do next. He had one contact. A Swiss doctor named Ernesto Kocherthaler, an acquaintance from his time in Spain, a man Kolbe knew to have connections he had never discussed directly. He found a telephone. He made a call. That evening, Kocherthaler told him there was an American he should meet. Kolbe asked who. Kocherthaler said his name was Alan Dulles. He was running something called the Office of Strategic Services out of a flat in the Herrengasse. He had been in Bern since November 1942. He was, Kocherthaler said, the kind of man who might be worth talking to. The meeting was set for midnight. Kolbe picked up his briefcase with its 200 stolen documents and walked through the dark streets of Bern toward a conversation that would change the war. Alan Dulles answered the door himself. This was unusual. Dulles was the head of OSS operations in Switzerland, which meant he ran a network of agents, informants, and contacts across occupied Europe from a flat on one of the oldest streets in Bern. He had staff. He had security arrangements. He did not typically open his own door at midnight for men he had never met. But Kocherthaler had called ahead, and Dulles had a habit that separated him from most intelligence officers of his generation. He met people himself before deciding whether they were worth his time. Kolbe walked in carrying his briefcase. Dulles was 49 years old, a former Wall Street lawyer from a family with deep roots in American foreign policy. He was charming in the specific way of men who have spent decades getting other people to tell them things they did not plan to tell anyone. He offered Kolbe a drink. Kolbe sat down. And then, according to Dulles's own account written years later, Kolbe opened his briefcase and began placing documents on the table. Dulles looked at them and felt the specific unease of a professional who is seeing something that does not fit any category he has prepared for. The documents were originals. Not copies, not summaries, not paraphrases passed through 3 intermediaries. Original foreign ministry cables with authentication stamps, classification markings, and the signatures of senior German officials. There were reports on German military positions in Italy. There were diplomatic cables between Berlin and Tokyo discussing Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific. There was a communication from the German embassy in Ankara detailing the identities of British intelligence contacts in Turkey. There was internal foreign ministry correspondence about the state of German oil supplies. Dulles picked up one document and read it, then another. Then he stopped and looked at Kolbe. He said, "How did you get these?" Kolbe told him. He explained his position, his access, his method. He explained the false panel in his apartment. He explained the late nights in the office. He explained what he wanted in return, which was nothing except that the information be used against the people who had produced it. Dulles sat with this for a moment. His professional instinct said the same thing the British instinct had said. This is too good. Nobody walks in off the street with original foreign ministry documents and asks for nothing. The correct response was to thank the man, take his materials for analysis, and assume he was a German plant until proven otherwise. Dulles had been in the intelligence business long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in his profession was not the enemy you could see. It was the one who came bearing gifts. But there was something about the documents themselves that worked against easy dismissal. Dulles had been in Bern for 9 months. He had built a network of contacts across Switzerland and into the edges of occupied Europe. He had developed a sense, refined through hundreds of conversations, for the texture of genuine intelligence versus fabricated intelligence. Fabricated documents had patterns. They contained the right information in the wrong proportions. They answered the questions an enemy thought you were asking rather than the questions you had not yet thought to ask. They were too clean, too organized, too specifically relevant. The materials Kolbe had placed on his table were none of those things. They were messy in the way real intelligence is messy. Some of them were immediately important. Some were routine. Some were about matters Dulles had no context to evaluate. They covered an implausible range of subjects, military, diplomatic, economic, personal, in a way that suggested not selection but access. Whoever had assembled these documents had not been answering questions. They had been moving through a filing system and taking what was there. That was not how a disinformation operation worked. That was how a bureaucrat with a briefcase worked. Dulles told Kolbe he would need time to verify the materials. He told him to come back the following evening. He gave him a code name, George Wood. Then he showed him out and spent the rest of the night reading. By morning, he had sent an urgent cable to OSS headquarters in Washington. The cable described what he had and asked for immediate guidance on verification. The response came back within 24 hours, and it was not encouraging. Washington was skeptical. Several senior analysts reviewed the cable and concluded that the materials sounded too valuable to be genuine. The consensus was that Kolbe was almost certainly a German intelligence plant, that the documents were fabricated or selectively genuine, and that Dulles should proceed with extreme caution. Dulles read the cable, noted the consensus, and proceeded to ignore it. This was not recklessness. Dulles had been running intelligence operations since the First World War, when he had worked for the State Department in Bern, and famously turned down a meeting request from a Russian émigré who turned out to be Lenin, a decision he spent the rest of his career citing as evidence of the cost of following procedure over instinct. He was not going to make the same mistake twice. He began the methodical process of checking every verifiable fact in every document Kolbe had provided. The German military positions in Italy, he cross-referenced them against reports from other sources. They matched. The information about British intelligence contacts in Ankara, he sent a carefully worded query through back channels. The contacts were real and the details were accurate. The Japanese naval material, he passed it to colleagues in the Pacific Theater who confirmed the information aligned with intercepts from other sources. Document by document, fact by fact, over the following weeks, everything checked out. Every single thing. Dulles sent another cable to Washington. He wrote that George Wood was genuine, that the materials were authentic, and that they were looking at the most significant intelligence source the OSS had developed in Europe. Washington remained skeptical. Some analysts concluded that the successful verification itself proved the operation was sophisticated German deception. That a truly professional disinformation campaign would of course include verifiable facts to establish credibility before passing the critical false material. Dulles sent a third cable. It was shorter than the first two. It said, "I believe him." Kolbe returned to Berlin. He crossed back into Germany with an empty briefcase and a cover story about a routine courier mission and a meeting he had attended at the German embassy. He went back to his apartment and his desk and his filing system and his false panel behind the wall, and he began preparing for the next trip. What Dulles did not know yet, and what would only become clear over the following months, was the full scale of what Kolbe had access to. The Foreign Ministry courier system moved documents between Berlin and German diplomatic posts across the world. Kolbe, as Ritter's senior assistant, had legitimate access to the routing and classification systems. He could handle documents intended for other desks if the assigned officer was absent. He could request files for cross-reference purposes. He could move through the system in ways that were normal for his seniority and invisible to anyone not specifically watching him. Nobody was specifically watching him. Over the next 18 months, Kolbe would make 3 more trips to Bern. Each time he brought more than the last. Military intelligence, diplomatic cables, reports on German weapons development, information about Gestapo operations inside neutral countries. The identities of German agents operating in Britain, the United States, and South Africa. Assessments of internal German morale. Reports from German embassies in Japan, Turkey, Spain, and Portugal. Communications between Hitler and his field commanders that had been routed through foreign ministry channels. He carried all of it in a diplomatic briefcase across an international border in a country at war. By the time Dulles compiled the final count after the war, Kolbe had delivered 1,600 original documents to the OSS. 1,600. The entire OSS operation in Switzerland, with all its agents and contacts and networks, produced less than that in the same period. A single man with a briefcase and a false panel in his apartment had outrun an entire intelligence bureaucracy. Dulles described Kolbe in his post-war memoir as the most valuable agent the OSS ever ran in Europe. He wrote that the information Kolbe provided had directly influenced Allied military planning, that it had saved lives in ways that could never be fully calculated, that it had changed the course of specific operations whose outcomes would have been different without it. He wrote all of this in a book published in 1963. By that point, Fritz Kolbe had been living in obscurity for nearly 20 years, unknown to the public, unrecognized by any government, working a series of unremarkable jobs in Frankfurt and Geneva and eventually New York, where he sold coffee machines. But that came later. In the autumn of 1943, he was sitting at his desk in the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, initialing correspondence and stamping files and moving papers from one tray to another, while somewhere in Washington, analysts at OSS headquarters were beginning to understand that the man they had dismissed as too good to be true was in fact exactly that. Except that in this case, too good to be true turned out to simply be true. In the spring of 1944, a document crossed Alan Dulles's desk in Bern that stopped him mid-sentence. It was a foreign ministry cable from the German embassy in Ankara. Kolbe had brought it on his third trip, tucked inside a batch of 202 documents that he had assembled over 4 months of late nights and careful work. The cable described in routine bureaucratic language the identity of a British intelligence source inside the German embassy in Turkey. The source had a code name. The cable named the source's real identity. It named the handler. It described the information that had been passed. The British source inside the German embassy was actually a German double agent working against the British. Dulles read the cable and understood immediately what it meant. The British had a source they trusted. The source was lying to them. Every piece of intelligence that source had provided, and the cable suggested the relationship had been running for months, needed to be reassessed. Operations that had been planned on the basis of that intelligence needed to be stopped or redesigned. Men whose safety depended on that intelligence being accurate were potentially in danger. He forwarded the information to British intelligence immediately. The British response was to question the reliability of the source. They had built an operation around this agent. They had invested in the relationship, trusted the product, reported it upward. Accepting that the agent was a German plant meant accepting that they had been deceived for months. The institutional resistance to that conclusion was, Dulles noted in his files, considerable. It took weeks of pressure and additional documentation before London accepted what Kolbe's cable had stated plainly on the first page. This pattern, Kolbe delivering accurate intelligence, the recipients resisting it because it complicated what they already believed, would repeat itself throughout 1944 in ways that had consequences Kolbe never learned about and Dulles only partially documented. The most significant case involved Operation Overlord. In the months before the Normandy landings, Kolbe delivered foreign ministry cables that contained German military assessments of Allied intentions. The cables showed that the German High Command was divided on where the invasion would land. Some believed Normandy. Most believed the Pas de Calais. The cables also contained something more specific. Internal communications suggesting that German counterintelligence had identified certain Allied deception operations as deceptions. The Allied deception program, Operation Bodyguard, the elaborate effort to convince Germany the main landing would come at Calais, was partly compromised. Not fully, not catastrophically. But the Germans were not as thoroughly deceived as the Allies believed. Dulles forwarded this immediately. The Allied planners reviewed it, weighed it against their existing assessments, and concluded that their deception operation was still intact enough to proceed. They were correct in the outcome. The landing succeeded. But the margin had been closer than the official histories acknowledged, and part of what had kept that margin from collapsing was intelligence Kolbe had stolen from a filing system in Berlin. Kolbe made his fourth and final trip to Bern in the autumn of 1944. He was 43 years old. He had been running this operation alone for 14 months, with no support network, no handler in Berlin, no emergency protocol if something went wrong. Every trip across the border had required a legitimate courier assignment, which meant he had to maneuver himself into the rotation without appearing to seek it. Every document he carried had to be selected, copied, or taken in a way that left no gap in the filing system. Every conversation he had at the foreign ministry had to be normal, unremarkable, the conversation of a man with nothing on his mind except the routine business of diplomatic administration. He had not told anyone, not a friend, not a colleague, not a family member. The secret had lived inside him for 2 years with no outlet except the trips to Bern and the meetings with Dulles, which were themselves conducted in a foreign country under a code name at addresses that changed with each visit. On the fourth trip, he brought 306 documents. Dulles met him at the Herrengasse flat and they worked through the night, reviewing the materials. At some point in the early morning hours, Dulles looked up from a cable he had been reading and told Kolbe that the war was going to end within a year. Germany was finished. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Front had been broken at Normandy. The internal assessments Kolbe had been bringing out of the foreign ministry for the past year had shown the progressive deterioration of German strategic position with a clarity that the Wehrmacht's own officers were apparently not permitted to communicate upward without sanitizing. Kolbe asked what would happen after. Dulles said he would be taken care of. The OSS would ensure it. He said Kolbe had done something extraordinary and that it would be recognized. He said these things with the confidence of a man who believed them. He was wrong, and he may have known it even as he said it. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Fritz Kolbe presented himself to American authorities in Frankfurt with his documentation, his copies of documents, his records of what he had passed, his correspondence with Dulles, and waited to be debriefed, resettled, compensated, and recognized as the most productive Allied intelligence asset of the European war. The American military government looked at his file and classified it. The newly formed West German government was told about Kolbe's wartime activities. Their response was not gratitude. Their response was the response of an institution staffed largely by men who had served the previous government. Suspicion, hostility, and a quiet but persistent campaign to have Kolbe investigated as a traitor. In West Germany in the late 1940s, a man who had stolen documents from the foreign ministry and given them to the Americans was not a hero. He was an embarrassment. He was evidence of a kind of resistance that made people who had not resisted uncomfortable. He was denied a pension. He was denied employment in the Foreign Service, despite his 17 years of professional experience. Former colleagues who had joined the Nazi Party served the Reich and emerged in 1945 with their careers intact were given positions in the new German diplomatic infrastructure. Kolbe, who had risked his life to undermine that Reich from inside, was told his record made him unsuitable. He went to Geneva. He worked for a Swiss company. He sold coffee machines. Dulles became director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1953. He spent the first years of his tenure building the institution that would define American intelligence for the next generation. He wrote about Kolbe in internal documents, in memos, and assessments of what the OSS had achieved in Europe. He described George Wood as the most valuable source he had ever run. He said it in classified documents that nobody outside the intelligence community would read for decades. He did not say it publicly until 1963 when he published his memoir. By then, Kolbe was 62 years old, living quietly in Frankfurt, not selling coffee machines anymore, but not doing much else either. The memoir named him. It described what he had done. It was the first public acknowledgement from anyone in any official capacity that Fritz Kolbe had existed in the way he had actually existed. Kolbe read it. He gave a small number of interviews in the years that followed carefully to historians and journalists who sought him out. He was not bitter in the way that might have been expected. He was something harder to describe, a man who had made a decision based on what he believed was right, and had spent 20 years watching the world arrange itself around that decision as if it had never happened. He died on February 16, 1971 in Frankfurt. He was 70 years old. No government had honored him. No country had given him a medal. The Federal Republic of Germany, whose existence had been made more possible by what he had done, had spent the years after the war treating him as a problem rather than an asset. The United States, for whose intelligence service he had delivered more original documents than any other single source in the European theater, had classified the evidence of what he had done and moved on. It was not until 2004 that the German government officially acknowledged Fritz Kolbe's contribution to the defeat of National Socialism. A small ceremony was held. Officials said appropriate things. His name was added to a list of people who had done what they should be remembered for doing. He had been dead for 33 years. There is a specific kind of story that history produces occasionally, where the person who changes the outcome of something enormous receives nothing from that outcome except the knowledge that they did it. Kolbe's version of that story is particularly clear because the contrast is so direct. The men who served the Reich and survived went on to careers, pensions, positions, and in some cases, honors. The man who stole the Reich's secrets and handed them to its enemies spent the post-war years selling coffee machines and waiting for a recognition that arrived 3 decades after he died. He had known the risk from the beginning. When he sat across from Alan Dulles in that flat on the Herrengasse in August 1943, he had not asked for money, a new identity, or a guarantee of protection. He had asked only that the information be used. It was used. It changed things. Specific operations succeeded that would otherwise have failed. Specific men survived who would otherwise have died. The war ended when it ended, partly because of what moved through a false panel in an apartment in Berlin, and across a border in a diplomatic briefcase and onto a table in Bern at midnight. Fritz Kolbe knew this. He had to live with knowing it and being the only one in the room who seemed to remember. That is not the ending the story deserves. It is the ending the story has,